My grandmother was born in a fishing village on the coast of Hokkaido in 1938. She survived the war. She survived the famine that followed. She survived things she would never speak about except once, on the night before she died, when she called me to her bedside and told me about the Gashadokuro. She said it in a whisper, as if speaking the name too loudly might summon it. The starving skeleton. The giant made of bones. A yokai formed from the accumulated remains of people who died of starvation, their rage and hunger fusing into something that towers above the treeline and wanders the countryside at night, biting the heads off the living because it can never be full. Because the hunger that created it has no end. She told me this story not as a myth but as testimony. She said she saw it. She was 9 years old. It was the winter of 1947. The war had ended, but the suffering had not. Her village had been a fishing community, but the boats were gone, conscripted by the military and never returned. The fields had produced almost nothing that autumn. People were eating bark. People were eating the paste between the walls of their houses. People were dying quietly in their homes and not being found for days because their neighbors were too weak to check on them. My grandmother said 15 people in the village died that winter. Some of the bodies were buried in the frozen ground. Others were placed in a storage shed at the edge of the village because the ground was too hard to dig. They waited there, frozen and patient, stacked like cordwood under canvas sheets. She said the sound came first. It was a January night. No moon. The kind of cold that made the wooden walls of her family's house pop and crack like something was testing their strength. She was lying between her mother and her younger brother under every blanket they owned, trying to sleep, when she heard a rhythmic crunching from outside. Like footsteps, but wrong. Too heavy. Too slow. And between each step, a sound like tree branches rubbing together in wind, except there was no wind. Her mother heard it too. She put her hand over my grandmother's mouth and held her brother tight and whispered, "Do not move. Do not look." The crunching grew louder. The ground shook with each impact, subtle tremors that my grandmother felt through the wooden floor. Whatever was walking outside was enormous. She could track its movement by the sound, each step covering a distance that no human stride could match. It moved from the east end of the village toward the center, slowly, deliberately. Then it stopped. Directly outside their house. My grandmother said she could hear breathing. But not normal breathing. It was a rattling, hollow sound, like wind blowing through a cave. Like air being drawn through something that no longer had lungs. Something scraped against the roof. Not a branch. Something that moved with intention. It traced a line across the thatch from one end of the house to the other, as if a finger the size of a tree trunk were testing the structure. Deciding whether it was worth opening. Her mother was praying. Silent prayers, her lips moving against my grandmother's hair. Her brother was unconscious or pretending to be. My grandmother lay perfectly still with her mother's hand over her mouth and her eyes squeezed shut so tightly that she saw shapes in the darkness behind her eyelids. The thing outside made a sound. My grandmother described it as a laugh, but not a laugh made by a mouth. A laugh made by bones. A laugh made by a rib cage vibrating in the cold, by a jawbone chattering not from cold but from something worse than cold. From hunger. From an appetite that had been building for months as the dead accumulated and the ground refused to hold them and the rage of the starving dead had nowhere to go except upward, into something that walked. Then it moved on. The crunching resumed. Each step shook the ground a little less as it moved away from their house, toward the edge of the village, toward the shed where the dead were stored. In the morning, her father went outside. The snow had recorded everything. Footprints. Each one was nearly 3 feet long and pressed 6 inches into the packed snow. They led from the eastern hills, through the center of the village, to the storage shed. The shed had been torn open. The canvas was shredded. The bodies were gone. All 15 of them. There was no blood. No drag marks. No trail leading away. The footprints ended at the shed. Whatever had taken the dead had simply ceased to exist once it had fed. Or it had risen back to whatever height put it beyond the range of human sight and walked away above the clouds. My grandmother finished the story and looked at me with eyes that were completely clear. "It is still walking," she said. "Wherever people die hungry. Wherever the dead are not buried with respect. It walks. It is always walking. It never stops because it can never be full." She died the next morning. I thought about her story the way you think about any deathbed confession from an elderly relative. With love. With respect. With the gentle assumption that memory and mythology had merged over 80 years and produced something vivid but ultimately fictional. Then, last autumn, I visited Hokkaido. I went to the village where she was born. It is mostly abandoned now. A few houses remain, and an old man who remembered my grandmother's family agreed to show me around. I asked him about the winter of 1947. He went very quiet. Then he walked me to the eastern edge of the village, where a patch of ground remained bare despite the surrounding grass. He pointed at the dirt. "Nothing grows here," he said. "Nothing has grown here since that winter. The soil is dead." I looked down. The bare patch was roughly 3 feet long. The shape of a footprint. I drove back to Sapporo that evening as the sun was setting. On the highway, something made me look in the rearview mirror. In the distance, far behind me, silhouetted against the orange sky, something stood above the treeline. It was shaped like a person. It was the color of bone. I drove faster. When I looked again, it was gone. But the trees where it had stood were broken. Snapped at the height of 30 feet, as if something impossibly tall and impossibly heavy had leaned against them. I have not been back to Hokkaido. I light incense for my grandmother every week. And I make sure, always, that the dead are treated with respect. Because she was right. It is still walking. It is always walking. And it is always hungry.